Chapter 86. Return to the Winterfell, R18. The stay at Sea Dragon Point lasted a half-moon. Ned Stark used the time to let his men rest. The Wolf Guard had marched through the ruins of Valyria and spent weeks at sea. They needed decent food and unbroken sleep. Ned spent his days organizing the cargo, checking the scrolls, and ensuring the Valyrian steel and ancient tomes were packed securely into unmarked wooden crates. They did not take the entire hoard to Winterfell. Ned decided to leave half the treasure, including the majority of the gold and the dragonbinder horns, secured in the deep vaults of Sea Dragon Hold under Benjen's watch. He took the other half, the raw steel ingots, the weapons, the dragon eggs, the glass candles, and the books, with him on the journey inland. The caravan moved at a steady pace. Heavy draft horses pulled the reinforced wagons across the wolfswood. The weather was turning colder, the autumn winds stripping the leaves from the trees. The Wolf Guard rode in formation around the wagons, their discipline sharp. Ned rode at the front with Benjen. They spoke little, keeping their attention on the road and the surrounding woods. It took them 2 weeks to cross the distance. On the 15th day of their march, the gray stone towers of Winterfell came into view above the tree line. The heavy oak and iron gates were already open when Ned's party arrived. The courtyard was busy with the usual morning activities, but work stopped as the Lord of Winterfell rode through the gates, followed by the wagons and his personal guard. Ned dismounted and handed his reins to a stable boy. Ashera stood on the steps of the great keep. She wore a simple, warm dress of dark wool, a thick gray cloak draped over her shoulders. She held 1-year-old Ricard in her arms, while a maid stood nearby struggling to hold a squirming 2-year-old Arya. "Welcome home, my lord," Ashera said, her violet eyes shining. "It is good to be back," Ned replied. He leaned in and kissed her softly, then looked down at the gathering of his pack. Cregan, 8.5 years old, and Jon, 7 years old, ran down the steps. They were growing taller, their faces losing the roundness of early childhood. Rhaenys, now 10, followed them at a more measured pace, holding the hand of 4-year-old Sansa. Ned dropped to one knee, opening his arms. Cregan hit him first, wrapping his arms around Ned's neck. "You were gone so long, father," Cregan exclaimed. "Did you win the games? Did you bring the cup?" "We did well enough, Cregan," Ned smiled, returning the fierce hug. He reached out and pulled Jon into the embrace as well. Jon hugged him back tightly, his quiet voice steady. "We kept the castle safe while you were away, father, just as you asked." "I know you did, Jon. Good lads." Ned stood up, turning to the girls. He scooped Sansa up, kissing her cheek. "And my beautiful girls, how have you been?" "We're good, Uncle Ned," Rhaenys answered with a smile. Ned smiled, setting Sansa down gently. He stepped up to Ashera. He reached out and took Ricard from her arms, the 1-year-old burbling happily at the sight of him. Then, he turned to the maid and scooped up the fiercely squirming Arya with his other arm. Holding a child in each arm, Ned felt the heavy weight of his journey truly lift. Arya immediately began pulling on his beard, while Ricard patted his cold breastplate. Elia Martell and Anna stood further up the steps. Anna gave Ned a brief, acknowledging nod. She looked healthy, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Elia offered a polite smile, her hands folded in front of her. Arthur Dane stood off to the side, wearing a plain leather tunic and a sword at his hip. He caught Ned's eye and inclined his head. "Ser Roderick," Ned called out. The stout master-at-arms stepped forward from the crowd. "My lord, take these 3 wagons to the deep vaults beneath the first keep," Ned instructed. His voice was calm and even. "Have the men unload the crates there. Once they are inside, lock the doors. You will keep the only key, and you will post 2 guards at the entrance at all times. No one enters without my direct permission." Roderick Castle looked at the plain wooden crates. He did not ask what was inside them. He simply nodded. "It will be done, Lord Stark." Ned turned back to his wife. "I need a bath." "The water is already heating in your chambers," Ashera said. Ned left the courtyard and walked through the stone halls of Winterfell. The air inside the castle was warm, heated by the water piped through the walls from the hot springs below. He entered his chambers, feeling the aches of the long road. Before he could begin to unbuckle his riding leathers, the door to the adjoining nursery opened quietly. Ashera walked in. In her arms, wrapped in thick, soft furs, was a tiny bundle. Ned's breath hitched. He forgot his exhaustion walking over to his wife. Ashera pulled back the furs, revealing the sleeping face of a newborn infant, his cheeks flushed with warmth. He was born 20 days ago, Ashera whispered, her eyes filled with profound love. The maester says he is as strong as a little bear. Ned looked down at the tiny, fragile life. He reached out a calloused finger, gently stroking the downy dark hair on the baby's head. He is beautiful, Ashera. You are incredible. He looked up at her. What have you named him? Ashera smiled softly. I was waiting for you to return, to give him his name. Ned shook his head gently. I did not think much on it during the voyage. I wanted you to name him this time, my love. A name you favor. Ashera's smile deepened. I have thought of a few names, but the one I like the most is Alaric. Alaric Stark. Ned tested the name. It was strong, bearing the weight of ancient kings, yet possessing a melodic grace. It honored her father, Lord Alaric Dane of Starfall. Well, that is his name then, Ned said, leaning in to kiss her forehead and then the baby's. Alaric Stark. Welcome to the north, little one. Ashera beamed, shifting the baby gently. I will put Alaric back in his cradle. Your bath is ready. She left the room quietly. Ned stripped off his riding leathers and his tunic, stepping into the large wooden tub filled with steaming water. The heat eased the tension in his muscles. He sat back and closed his eyes. When the water cooled and their skin pruned did they rise. Ned stepped out first, wrapping her in a thick towel before drying himself. He dressed in the clean gray tunic and dark trousers, pulling her close for one last slow kiss that promised more later. Chapter 87 Progress. Dinner that evening was held in the family solar rather than the great hall. It was a private meal. A long wooden table was set with roasted fowl, baked root vegetables, fresh bread, and dark ale. Ned sat at the head of the table. Ashera sat to his right, with Elia and Rhaenys beside her. Anna sat to his left next to Cregan, Jon, and Sansa. Arthur Dane joined them, sitting at the far end. The room was filled with the sounds of plates clinking and quiet talk. How was King's Landing, Ned? Arthur asked, cutting a piece of meat. How is Robert? He is fitter than when you last saw him, Ned said plainly. It seems the games have done him good. He always loved fighting more than a council meeting, Arthur remarked, taking a bite of bread. Elia looked up from her plate. And the Lannisters? Did they hold much influence at the games? Lord Tywin paid for a significant portion of the event, Ned said. The Queen's family is very present at court, but Jon Arryn manages the day-to-day affairs. He keeps the peace. The talk shifted to the children. Uncle Arthur taught us how to hold a shield wall, Cregan said loudly, looking down the table at the Kingsguard knight. He said if we drop our arms, we die. It is a fundamental lesson, Arthur said smoothly, taking a sip of ale. A shield is useless if you do not have the strength to hold it up. I held mine longer than Cregan, Jon pointed out quietly, looking at his plate. Only by a few seconds, Cregan shot back. That is enough, Ned said. His voice was not loud, but the boys stopped arguing immediately. Endurance is important, but strength of arm is only one part of training. Tomorrow morning, the three of you will meet me in the godswood. Rhaenys nodded respectfully. Yes, Uncle Ned. The rest of the dinner passed with talk of the coming winter stores and the repairs needed on the outer walls. Ned listened more than he spoke, gathering the information he needed to resume his duties as Lord of Winterfell. When the meal ended, the children were sent to their beds. The next morning, the air in the godswood was crisp and cold. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. The ancient weirwood tree stood in the center, its white bark pale in the morning light, its red leaves rustling faintly in the wind. Ned sat cross-legged on the cold ground, facing the heart tree. Cregan, Jon, and Rhaenys arrived a few minutes later. They wore warm cloaks over their tunics. They stood before Ned, waiting for instruction. Sit, Ned told them. The three children sat down on the ground in a row, facing him. Before I left for the south, I gave you a set of lessons, Ned began. Ways of breathing, clarity of mind. I told you to practice clearing your minds of clutter and finding the stillness within yourselves. Today, I will see if you have done the work. He reached into his pouch and took out 3 small, smooth river stones. He placed one on the ground in front of each child. The power we draw upon is not magic in the way the stories tell it, Ned explained, keeping his words simple and practical. It is the current of life. It flows through the earth, through the trees, and through us. To move a stone, you do not push it with your mind. You connect your mind to the stone, and you move yourself. He looked at Rhaenys first. She was the oldest, and she had shown the most patience in her previous lessons. Rhaenys, begin with your breathing. Find the center. Rhaenys closed her dark eyes. She took a slow, deep breath in through her nose, held it for a moment, and exhaled slowly through her mouth. Her shoulders dropped, losing their tension. Now, Ned said, feel the stone in front of you. Do not look at it with your eyes. Look at it with your awareness. Rhaenys remained still. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, the small river stone gave a slight tremble. It scraped against the frozen dirt, moving a fraction of an inch to the left. I can feel it, Rhaenys said softly, her eyes still closed. It feels heavy and cold. Do not judge how it feels, Ned corrected her gently. Just accept that it is there. Now lift it. Rhaenys frowned slightly. Her breathing hitched, losing its steady rhythm. The stone remained flat on the ground. She opened her eyes and let out a frustrated sigh. I lost it, she said. You tried to force it, Ned told her. When you force it, you separate yourself from the current. You make it a contest of strength. It is not a contest. Try again later. You have the focus, but you lack the release. He turned to Cregan. Cregan was already staring hard at his stone. His brow furrowed in deep concentration. His hands were clenched into fists on his knees. Cregan, you are tense, Ned observed. I am trying to move it, Cregan said through gritted teeth. Stop trying, Ned ordered. Cregan blinked and looked up at his father, confused. If I don't try, how will it move? By intending it to move without demanding it, Ned explained. Unclench your hands. Fix your posture. You are breathing too fast. Cregan took a deep breath, mimicking Rhaenys' earlier technique, but his movements were sharp and impatient. He stared at the stone. The stone suddenly shot forward, skittering across the frost and hitting Ned's boot with a sharp clack. Cregan smiled broadly. I did it. You did, Ned agreed, picking up the stone and tossing it back to his son. But you did it with anger. You shoved the current instead of guiding it. If that had been a sword instead of a stone, you would have lost control of the blade. Control is more important than power. Power without control is dangerous. You must learn to calm your mind before you act. Cregan's smile faded slightly, but he nodded. Yes, father. Ned turned to Jon. Jon was sitting very still. His dark gray eyes were fixed on the stone in front of him, but his gaze seemed unfocused, as if he were looking through it. His breathing was slow and even, matching the rhythm Ned had taught them. Jon, Ned said quietly. Jon did not look up. He kept his focus on the stone. Slowly, without any sudden jerks or skittering, the river stone lifted off the frozen ground. It hovered an inch in the air, remarkably steady. Cregan and Rhaenys turned their heads, watching the floating stone in surprise. The stone remained in the air for 10 seconds. Then, Jon's shoulders slumped slightly, and the stone dropped back to the dirt with a soft thud. Jon looked up at Ned, his expression neutral, waiting for the assessment. That was steady, Ned said. How did you do it? I imagined the stone was part of my hand, Jon answered simply. I just decided to lift my hand. Ned nodded. That is the correct approach. You removed the wall between yourself and the object, but you lost your breath quickly. Holding the bond drains your bodily strength. If you do not breathe correctly while holding the bond, you will exhaust yourself. Ned stood up, stepping back from the three of them. The initial lift is only the beginning, Ned told them, his voice taking on the unyielding tone of a master-at-arms. The true mastery is found in the endurance of the hold. For the next hour you will not speak. You will not stand. You will hold the current. For the next hour, the quiet godswood transformed into a silent crucible of willpower. The winter sun climbed slowly above the high walls of Winterfell, casting long, pale beams of light through the bone-white branches, but the children remained rooted to the frozen earth. Cregan's face grew flushed, his breath puffing in rapid, frustrated clouds. He struggled immensely with the subtle restraint required. His river stone would hover for a fleeting moment, then crash down as his impatience broke the unseen bond. Yet, under Ned's quiet, correcting murmurs, the young heir slowly stopped trying to conquer the stone through sheer dominance. He learned to soften his spiritual grip, letting the earth's natural energy support the weight rather than his own anger. By the end of the hour, his stone hovered a steady inch above the frost, anchored by the dense, earthy resilience of the north. Rhaenys fought her own fiery nature. Ned gave her a second, smaller pebble, tasking her with making them circle each other. Her intense, driving will made the stones clash and clatter together loudly at first. Be the water in the springs, not the flame, Ned guided her, pacing slowly behind her. Taking a shuddering breath, she began to weave her unseen grasp, turning her jagged, forceful intent into a smooth, flowing stream. The pebbles separated and began a slow, silent, orbiting dance above her open palms. Jon sat as still as the ancient kings in the crypts. He held his stone aloft with an eerie, flawless calm, but the sheer, focused depth of his mind left his physical body completely vulnerable. He began to shiver violently, the freezing mud seeping through his breeches as he entirely forgot to protect his own flesh from the elements. Ned knelt beside him, teaching the boy to split the river, to use one half of the unseen current to hold the stone, and the other half to stoke the natural fires of his own blood. The shivering ceased, leaving the boy in a state of perfect, insulated balance. When the great iron bell in the distant courtyard finally told the passing of the hour, the three children slumped forward, completely drained. They had not swung a single wooden sword, nor run a single sprint, yet they looked as exhausted as men who had marched for days in deep snow. When that hour passed, Ned did not let them rest. He gathered the stones. Holding the current while sitting on solid ground is one task, Ned said. Holding it while the world tries to throw you off balance is another. He led them deeper into the godswood. A thick, gray fog rolled off the largest hot spring, blanketing the ground and severely limiting visibility. A fallen oak log bridged the bubbling water. Its bark was stripped away, leaving the wood entirely slick with the freezing mist. Stand on the log, Ned instructed, handing their stones back. Walk across. Keep your stones in the air. They stepped onto the slippery wood. The fog made the footing treacherous. Cregan found his stance almost immediately. He bent his knees, planted his boots firmly on the slick wood, and held his stone aloft with a steady, stubborn grip. He crossed the log without slipping once. Rhaenys struggled. Her sharp, fiery intent made her movements too rigid for the slick surface. She slipped twice, her stone splashing into the hot spring before she retrieved it. But she adapted. She slowed her breathing, letting her energy settle to match the gentle roll of the fog. By her third attempt, she walked across perfectly still, her stone hovering steadily above her palm. Jon, however, could not find the balance. His connection to the unseen current was so deep that he lost awareness of his own feet. When he focused his mind on the floating stone, his boots slipped on the wet wood. When he focused on his footing, the stone dropped from the air. He fell into the shallow, warm water half a dozen times, soaking his clothes. When the great iron bell in the distant courtyard telling another hour passed, the three children stepped off the log for the final time. Cregan and Rhaenys were exhausted but proud. Jon stood shivering on the bank, his stone held tightly in his physical hand, his head bowed in quiet frustration. Ned walked over to his nephew. He placed a firm hand on the boy's wet shoulder. You feel too much of the river, Jon, Ned said quietly. It makes it hard to focus on a single drop, let alone your own footing. Do not be discouraged. The depth of your connection is a gift. It will simply take longer to master. We will try again tomorrow. Ned stood before them, quiet pride swelling in his chest. You have all made remarkable progress, Ned praised softly, stepping forward to gather the fallen stones. The foundation is hardening. But remember, we do not try to lift heavy objects until the small ones are mastered. When you can hold a stone in the air for a full minute while holding a conversation, we will move to the next lesson. We will, they answered in unison. Go back inside, Ned said. Find Maester Luwin. It is time for the lessons of the past. The children stood up, bowed their heads slightly, and walked out of the godswood, their boots crunching on the frost. Ned remained by the weirwood tree. He looked up at the carved face in the white bark, the red sap crying from its eyes. The north was quiet today, but he knew the peace was temporary. He had the steel and he was training the next generation. It was a start. He closed his eyes and began his own breathing lessons, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Chapter 88 Time skip. 5 years passed since the conclusion of the Grand Royal Games. The realm marched steadily into the year 295 AC. For the southern kingdoms, the long summer was a period of endless tournaments. It was a time of lavish feasts, political posturing, and idle complacency. The lords of the Reach grew fat on their bountiful harvests. The knights of the Westerlands polished their armor and rode in straight lines for the applause of the small folk. For the North, those 5 years were entirely different. They were defined by relentless, quiet labor. It was a period of unprecedented, grueling expansion. Under the steady, unwavering guidance of Eddard Stark, the frozen expanse of the North was fundamentally transformed. The transformation began with the very earth beneath their feet. Mile by mile, the roads of North expanded and connected to every holdfasts of Norths. The journey across the North, which once took weeks of miserable slogging, was reduced to a matter of days. The stone did not stop at the roads. It rose into the sky at the borders. Moat Cailin had been a sinking ruin for thousands of years. It was a legendary choke point, but its defenses had crumbled into the bog. Ned Stark ordered it completely rebuilt. The ancient, moss-covered foundations were excavated and reinforced with the new poured rock. 20 massive towers were raised from the black waters of the swamp. They were built tall and sheer, capped with dark basalt. Thick, high curtain walls connected the towers, sealing the causeway entirely. The walls bristled with heavy iron scorpions and spitfires. A permanent garrison of 500 heavily armed men held the fortress. The throat of the North was permanently closed to any hostile force from the south. The building continued further south, at the crossing of the Green Fork. The temporary timber bridge that Ned had constructed during the rebellion was torn down. In its place, northern stonemasons and riverland laborers erected a massive, permanent bridge of solid granite. It featured wide arches to allow the river traffic to pass safely beneath. The new bridge was wide enough for 2 heavy wagons to pass side by side. Most importantly, it was declared a royal bridge. It was free for all merchants and travelers to use. From the windows of the twins, Lord Walder Frye watched the endless stream of trade bypass his ancient toll booth. He watched his leverage evaporate into the swift current of the river, completely powerless to stop it. The wealth generated by the North allowed the lesser lords to fortify their own holdings. Houses like Glover and Mormont used their newfound wealth to tear down their ancient, drafty timber halls. They raised formidable, thick-walled keeps of solid stone in their place, ensuring their people would never freeze when the long night finally fell. Winterfell itself expanded outward like a growing beast. The Winter Town, once a temporary refuge of wooden shacks, grew into a permanent, bustling center of trade. The streets were paved with the same gray stone as the King's Road. The air was constantly thick with the smoke of industry. The glassworks operated day and night. The heat of the massive kilns warmed the surrounding district even in the deepest snows. Seeking new avenues of wealth, Ned utilized the massive whale hunts of the Shivering Sea. The thick, rendered blubber was mixed with lye and infused with crushed pine needles and the rare winter roses grown in the new gardens. The result was a hard, pale soap that lathered beautifully. It chased away the foul stench of the cramped southern cities. These simple blocks of cleanliness quickly became a highly demanded luxury in the courts of King's Landing and across the narrow sea. But the true engine of northern wealth poured from the copper stills. The distilleries in the Winter Town, and the franchised operations in Barrowton and White Harbor, produced rivers of strong spirits. The clear, biting vodka known as Winter's Breath kept the northern blood warm. The amber, peat-smoked whiskey commanded staggering prices in the free cities. Meanwhile, the Reach, which always held the realm's purse strings through its massive, unending harvests. They controlled the food, and therefore they controlled the gold. They found themselves in a deeply frustrating bind. With the North producing a significant portion of its own food in the new glass gardens, and strictly controlling its vast reserves of silver, the Tyrells and their bannermen lost their leverage. They could no longer demand exorbitant prices for their surplus summer crops. When the merchants of the Reach attempted to raise the cost of grain, the northern buyers simply refused the terms. They walked away from the tables, forced to sell at minimal profit just to clear their bursting silos before the grain rotted. The lords of the Reach watched bitterly. They watched their hard-earned coin flow steadily north to purchase clear glass windows, fine wool, and strong spirits. Lord Stark purchased this cheap southern grain endlessly. He ordered massive, stone-lined silos built deep into the earth around Winterfell and the major keeps. He filled them to the brim, sealing them tight, storing the food in quiet, paranoid preparation for the long winter he knew was coming. The expansion of the North was not limited to the land. Over the 5 years, northern naval supremacy became an absolute, undeniable reality. 300 heavy carracks and specialized trade galleys now patrolled the freezing waters of the eastern and western coasts. They were massive ships, built with deep keels and triangular lateen sails that allowed them to cut aggressively into the wind. Their prows were capped with iron, built to shatter the hulls of lesser vessels. They served dual purposes. They suppressed piracy to the point of total extinction in the Sunset and Narrow Seas. The iron-born fishing smacks did not dare stray far from the sight of pike. They also established a fierce, untouchable trade network. A quiet but incredibly lucrative mutual trade route blossomed between Winterfell and Sunspear. Heavily insulated northern ships, their holds packed with sawdust and thick canvas, carried vast blocks of pure winter ice cut from the frozen lakes of the Wolfswood. The ice survived the long voyage south. It was sold in Dorne for a fortune, allowing the princes to cool their wine and their water gardens in the blistering heat. The ships returned north laden with swift, resilient Dornish sand steeds to improve the northern cavalry lines. They brought rare spices. Most importantly, they brought sacks of resilient white rice seeds from the distant east. These seeds were given to Howland Reed. The Crannogmen planted them in the shallow, muddy waters of the Neck. The strange crop took root, rapidly turning the impassable swamps into a thriving, vital breadbasket for the lower north. To the far north, the ancient shield of the realm was quietly and thoroughly reforged. Lord Stark kept his promises to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He ensured that every abandoned, crumbling fort along the wall was painstakingly rebuilt. Northern masons poured concrete into the deep fissures of the ice. They raised new walls of heavy timber and stone. The forts were not left empty to rot again. While the sworn Black brothers held the primary castles of Castle Black, the Shadow Tower, and Eastwatch, the restored outposts were heavily garrisoned by different men. Mountain clansmen, fiercely loyal to Winterfell, manned the towers. Detachments of the newly expanded Wolfguard walked the icy parapets. These northern warriors took no vows to the Watch. They wore no black cloaks, but they held the line with fanatical devotion, transforming the wall into an impenetrable frontier. The lands immediately south of the wall, the new gift, were fully settled. The clansmen farmed the rich, dark soil using the new iron plows. They paid no taxes to Winterfell. Every bushel of wheat and every sheared fleece was given directly to the Night's Watch, ensuring the Black brothers were well-fed and warmly clothed. A heavy, tense silence fell over the haunted forest beyond the ice. The chaotic, scattered wildling raids that had plagued the borders for centuries completely stopped. No more desperate bands were crossing the frozen rivers to steal sheep. The northern lords did not view this silence as a victory. They recognized it as a gathering storm. They knew the truth of the deep snows. The king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, had finally succeeded in his impossible task. He had beaten and bled the warring tribes into submission, uniting the free folk into a single massive host. The threat had changed from a nuisance to a true army. The heavy garrisons upon the wall waited quietly for the day that army decided to march south. To protect the internal peace of the vast kingdom, the Wolfguard swelled into a formidable, shadowy force. 5,000 highly conditioned members now wore the dark gray cloaks. They were trained relentlessly in the freezing mud of the Winterfell yards. They learned to run for miles with heavy sandbags upon their shoulders. They learned to fight in absolute darkness. They kept the king's peace across the new paved roads. They rooted out bandits in the deep woods. They walked the docks of the port cities with an eerie, perfect efficiency. They were the silent, lethal extension of Lord Stark's will. But military strength was not the only web cast over the realm. Lady Ashera Stark proved to be as formidable in the shadows as her husband was in the light. She wove a vast, intricate intelligence network built entirely upon the flow of northern trade. She did not use street urchins or professional spies. She used the merchants who carried the glass. She used the captains who sailed the carracks. She used the factors who negotiated the sale of the whiskey in the free cities. These men and women reported the subtle shifts in the market. They reported the hiring of mercenary companies in Essos. They reported the drunken boasts of southern lords and kinks in the taverns of King's Landing. Ashera sat in her solar in Winterfell, piecing the whispers together. She tracked the movements of the realm without ever leaving her hearth. The North was no longer blind to the machinations of the South. To arm the absolute elite of his growing forces, Eddard Stark worked in absolute, fanatical secrecy. Deep beneath the ancient walls of Winterfell, hidden behind heavy iron doors, a private forge burned with a heat that defied the winter. Lord Stark spent his nights working there, accompanied only by his master smith, Mikken. They allowed no other apprentices or helpers inside the sweltering cavern. They worked with the raw, smoke-rippled ingots recovered from the ashes of the Valyrian Peninsula. The ancient, magical metal was notoriously difficult to forge, prone to shattering under the hammer of a normal smith. Over the 5 years, they worked tirelessly. They painstakingly crafted new, perfectly balanced blades. They forged heavy, armor-piercing spear tips. They shaped lethal, unbreakable daggers. The ancient arsenal retrieved from the doom of the Dragon Lords quietly became the sharp, hidden teeth of the wolf. The next generation of the pack grew alongside this rising military and economic strength. Cregan, Jon, and Rhaenys left their childhood behind, entering their early teens. They were tall, strong, and deeply disciplined. Their secret training in the godswood matured into practical, everyday application. They were not kept sheltered behind the walls of Winterfell. They were sent west to the rugged cliffs of Sea Dragon Point, placed under the strict care of Arthur Dayne and Lyanna. There, they learned the brutal realities of the world. They learned to sail the heavy carracks under the command of Lord Benjen. They climbed the rigging in the freezing sea spray. They learned to navigate by the stars and the new magnetic compasses. They traveled as far as the free cities of Essos. They walked the bustling markets of Bravos and Pentos. They learned the intricacies of global trade, the weight of foreign coins, and the languages of the narrow sea. They observed the world to understand exactly what they would one day be required to protect. During these long, salt-stained voyages and the quiet years spent at the coastal fortress, an unspoken bond grew between the disguised Lyanna and the Sword of the Morning. They both shared the heavy secrets of the Tower of Joy. Their shared duty to the children slowly blossomed into a deep, quiet companionship. They found a measure of peace in the harsh winds of the western coast, standing together on the decks of the ships. Back in the heart of Winterfell, the cycle of preparation continued relentlessly with the younger pups. As Sansa, Arya, and young Rickard reached their 5th name days, they too were brought before the ancient heart tree. Ned sat with them upon the damp, mossy roots. He taught them to close their eyes to the cold. He taught them to breathe in the deep, slow rhythm of the north. He taught them to feel the wind before it brushed their cheeks, and to hear the water moving deep beneath the bedrock. The latent magic in their blood was coaxed awake. The legacy of the first men was secured in every child that bore the Stark name. In the Westerlands, Lord Tywin Lannister observed the shifting tides of trade and power with cold, pragmatic calculation. Refusing to be outmaneuvered or left behind, he formulated plans to secure favorable agreements for Casterly Rock. Over the course of the 5 years, he sent his envoys to the north. His sons, Jaime and Tyrion, rode the newly paved King's Road to Winterfell on multiple occasions. They sat in the solar and negotiated hard terms. It was a purely pragmatic arrangement. The Westerlands offered their abundant, cheap ore, iron, tin, and copper, to fuel the northern furnaces. In exchange, Tywin demanded priority access to the northern goods and heavily discounted tariffs on the imported spirits and glass. The gold kept flowing, binding the two disparate regions together through sheer economic necessity, while Tywin watched the realm carefully for any sign of weakness or opportunity. He has a few backup plans for North ready if it were needed. He also held a dangerous, living prize within his fortress. Theon Greyjoy, taken as a ward after the crushing of Pike, was not treated as an honored guest in Casterly Rock. He was not permitted to retain his identity. Over the 5 years, Tywin actively, ruthlessly molded the young Kraken. Far from the sea, stripped entirely of his iron-born pride and the savage customs of his people, the boy was subjected to harsh, unforgiving lessons. He lived under strict Lannister discipline. Tywin carefully shaped the boy into a compliant, fearful, and ruthless pawn. The old lion intended to one day send the broken boy back to rule the Iron Islands, ensuring the western seas would serve the West forever. Across the narrow sea, the Magisters of Myr grew increasingly desperate. Their historical, highly lucrative dominance over the clear glass trade was crumbling rapidly under the weight of Winterfell's superior, cheaper production. They watched their profits bleed away to the north. They resorted to subterfuge. They sent spies and master thieves, disguised heavily as simple merchants or wandering laborers. These agents infiltrated the winter town, seeking to steal the exact chemical compositions of the sand mixtures and the structural designs of the high-heat furnaces. Every single attempt failed entirely. The spies were thwarted before they could even breach the inner perimeters of the glassworks. They were caught by the vigilant, unervingly perceptive patrols of the Wolfguard. Defeated in the shadows, the Myrish spies vanished into the deep holding cells beneath Winterfell. The merchants of Myr realized they could not steal the secret. They began to look for other ways to disrupt the north. They waited patiently for a major conflict to break out in Westeros, hoping a massive civil war would eventually distract the wolves long enough for their heavily guarded secrets to be taken. The unrest caused by the North's rise was not limited to angry merchants and rival lords. In Old Town, the absolute center of learning and faith, the Citadel and the Starry September watched the prosperity of Winterfell with growing, deep-seated unease. The sudden, overwhelming wealth of a kingdom that held strictly to the old gods troubled the religious leaders. The North ignored the light of the Seven. They bypassed the traditional, hoarded knowledge of the maesters, building their own paper mills and sharing printed knowledge freely among their minor lords. The High Septon began to quietly stir his followers in the Grand Septs. He preached long, impassioned sermons against the foreign, heathen ways of the North. He warned that their unnatural glass and their potent spirits were affronts to the gods. The Archmesters whispered their concerns to the pious southern lords who came to Old Town for counsel. They watched the borders. They monitored the trade routes. They bided their time in the southern heat, silently waiting for any slight, any perceived insult, or any provocation from the North that might finally justify a holy call to rearm the faith militant and bring the wolves back under the control of the proper gods. The 5 years of peace were merely a tightening of the bowstring. Chapter 89, The Secrets of the Ash. /N. Yeah, I made a mistake. I made the ages of Cregan, Jon, and Rhaenys younger in this fanfic, so I'm going to change that from now on. Cregan 15, Rhaenys 17, Jon 13.5, Sansa 13, Arya 12, Ricard 11, Alaric 9 and Brandon 9, Benjen's son, and Serena 3, Benjen's daughter. The Sunset Sea was a vast, rolling expanse of dark gray water. The wind whipped across the deck of the Northern Carrack, carrying the bitter, biting cold that signaled they were finally nearing home. Standing at the starboard rail, their cloaks pulled tight against the sea spray, were 3 figures on the verge of adulthood. Cregan Stark, nearing his 15th name day, leaned heavily against the thick oak timber of the rail. He had grown broad and tall, his shoulders filling out his boiled leather tunic, possessing the undeniable, heavy build of his northern ancestors. Beside him stood Jon, slightly shorter but possessing a lean, coiled strength, his dark gray eyes fixed on the distant, unseen horizon. To Jon's left stood Rhaenys, wrapped in a heavy cloak of dark violet wool, her dark curls whipping wildly in the wind. At 17, she possessed a striking, fierce beauty, a perfect blend of Dornish grace and the hardened resilience she had learned in the snows of Winterfell. They were silent, lulled by the rhythmic crashing of the hull against the waves, but their minds were entirely occupied by the memories of the past 2 moons. I still smell the sulfur, Cregan muttered, rubbing a gloved hand over his face. Even with the freezing wind, I swear the ash is stuck in the back of my throat. It is the memory of it, Jon said quietly, not turning his gaze from the sea. The air there was not meant for the living. It was heavy, like breathing dirt and fire. Rhaenys shuddered slightly, pulling her cloak tighter. When we first sailed into the smoking sea, I thought Uncle Benjen had finally lost his wits. The water was literally boiling. The steam was so thick you couldn't see the prow of the ship. I kept waiting for the hull to melt beneath our boots. But the oasis, Cregan said, turning his head to look at the other 2. The awe in his voice was palpable, replacing his usual boisterous confidence. The moment we crossed that boundary, it was like stepping into another world. One heartbeat we were choking on yellow fog, and the next, the air was sweet. The trees were silver and green. It defied all reason. It defied nature, Jon agreed softly. The currents of the earth there were bound tightly, sealed away by an ancient will, a sacrifice. Before Rhaenys could add her own thoughts on the magnificent, unburnt black marble of the Temple of the 14 they had explored, a heavy, measured footstep sounded on the deck behind them. And that is exactly why you will speak of it to no one, a deep voice commanded. The 3 teenagers turned instantly, dropping their relaxed postures and standing straight. Lord Benjen Stark stepped out from the shadows of the mainmast. He wore a heavy sea cloak over his dark armor, his face weathered by the salt and the responsibilities of commanding the Western Fleet. He possessed the stern, unyielding authority of a seasoned lord, his gray eyes locking onto the 3 youths. You have seen the graveyard of the Dragon Lords, Benjen said, his voice low enough that it could not carry over the wind to the sailors working the rigging above. You have walked upon the ashes of the greatest empire in history, and you have stood within the sanctuary that survived the doom. It is a privilege. Your father deemed you old enough and disciplined enough to comprehend the truth of where our steel comes from. We understand, Uncle, Cregan said firmly, nodding his head. See that you do, Benjen warned, stepping up to the rail beside them. The world believes Valyria is a cursed, boiling wasteland that offers nothing but agonizing death to any ship foolish enough to approach it. That belief is our greatest shield. If the merchants of Essos, or the lords of the south, learned that a pristine sanctuary exists within those ruins, a vault holding the lost wealth of the freehold, they would not fear the curse. They would swarm the peninsula like locusts. Greed makes men blind to danger, John noted quietly. Exactly, Benjen agreed. They would sail thousands of ships into the smoking sea. Most would die, but enough would survive to shatter the sanctuary. They would disturb the delicate balance of the magic that preserves that valley, and the molten rock beneath would consume it all. You are not to speak of the silver trees, the clear stream, or the Black Temple to anyone outside of the pack. The story remains as it always has. We traded for the steel in the deep ports of Ashai, or scavenged it from forgotten wrecks. Is that entirely clear? Yes, Uncle. The three of them answered in unison, recognizing the absolute gravity of the command. Benjen's stern expression softened a fraction, a proud smile touching the corners of his mouth. You did well on the expedition. I watched you when we first set foot on the Black Glass docks. You were thrilled, but you kept your heads. You did not panic when the ash storms blew, and you respected the silence of the ruins. It was difficult not to be thrilled, Uncle, Rhaenys admitted, her eyes shining with the memory. To walk where the ancient dragon lords walked. And Aunt Anna. She looked like she wanted to conquer the ruins herself. Benjen chuckled, shaking his head. Anna has always possessed a spirit too large for a castle. Putting her in the middle of a shattered, ancient landscape only fueled her fire. And Arthur. Benjen glanced toward the stern of the ship. Arthur looked as though he was waiting for a stone gargoyle to challenge him to a duel. They are a formidable pair to travel with. As if summoned by the mention of their names, Arthur Dane and the woman known as Anna emerged from the lower cabins. Arthur wore his simple gray leathers, Dawn wrapped securely and strapped to his back. Anna wore practical trousers and a heavy wool tunic, her auburn hair braided tight against the wind. Anna walked over to the rail, inhaling the freezing sea air with a deep, satisfied breath. I can smell the pines, she announced, a fierce grin on her face. We are close. A few more hours, Lady Anna, Arthur confirmed, looking toward the dark line of the horizon. The watchtowers of Sea Dragon Point will be visible soon. Good, Anna said, rubbing her hands together to ward off the chill. The heat of the summer sea was making me lethargic. I need the frost to wake my blood again. She looked at the three teenagers. I hope you three have not forgotten your footwork while we were aboard this floating log. I intend to test your speed the moment we find solid ground. Cregan groaned good-naturedly. Aunt Anna, we spent 2 moons hauling crates of raw steel ingots from a temple to a ship. My arms are longer than my legs at this point. Can we not rest for a single day? Rest is for the dead, Cregan, Anna retorted with a wink. And you are far too loud to be dead. True to Anna's word, as the afternoon wore on, the jagged, imposing cliffs of the western coast broke through the ocean mist. Rising from the dark basalt rock, looking like a natural extension of the stone itself, was the massive fortress of Sea Dragon Hold. The ship navigated the deep-water harbor smoothly, the sailors working the great lateen sails with practiced precision. The heavy harbor chains were lowered, and the vessel glided toward the immense wooden docks that jutted out into the sea. The moment the gangplank hit the stone pier, a horn sounded from the battlements, announcing the return of the Lord of Sea Dragon Point. A welcoming party was already making its way down the switchback road from the upper keep. Leading them was Lady Daisy Stark, a formidable sight in her heavy furs, an iron mace resting comfortably at her hip. At her side stood a sturdy, dark-haired 9-year-old boy named Brandon, clutching a wooden practice sword. Balanced effortlessly on Daisy's hip was 3-year-old Serena, scowling at the sea spray with the same fierce expression as her mother. When Benjen stepped off the gangplank, he reached into his pouch. Before returning his wife's greeting, he pulled out a delicate, priceless chain of pure Valyrian gold, a shimmering trinket scavenged from the ancient vault. He held it out to little Serena. For my beautiful girl, Benjen smiled, dangling the gold. Serena looked at the glittering chain. She grabbed it with a chubby fist, examined it for a fraction of a second, and promptly threw it onto the stone pier with a loud, unbothered clack. Ben-Jen let out a long, heavy sigh, watching the priceless artifact hit the dirt. "She is already turning into a Bear Island woman," he muttered. Daisy threw her head back and let out a booming laugh, uncaring of the sailors or the guards watching them. "She knows you can't hit anyone with a necklace, Wolf," Daisy declared, stepping forward and pulling her husband into a fierce, breathless embrace. She turned her attention to the rest of the party. She offered a respectful nod to Arthur and Anna, then looked at the three teenagers descending the plank. "Look at you three," Daisy grinned, placing her free hand on her hip. "You leave as pups, and you return smelling of sulfur and looking like you've wrestled a kraken. The sea agrees with you." "The sea was fine," Cregan said, stepping onto the solid stone with a sigh of immense relief. "It was the terrifying, ruined continent that took some getting used to." "Well, you can tell me all about the horrors over a hot meal," Daisy commanded, gesturing toward the steep road leading to the fortress. "The baths are drawn, and the cooks have been roasting a stag since the watchtowers spotted your sails. Welcome to the point." For 3 days, the travelers remained at Sea Dragon Point. The sheer physical exhaustion of a 2-moon voyage to the most dangerous, hostile environment in the known world finally caught up with the youth. They slept for 12 hours at a time in the warm, draft-free guest chambers of the hold, waking only to devour massive portions of roasted meat and heavy stews before returning to their beds. The fortress was a marvel of the new northern architecture, filled with the bustling energy of the Western Fleet's headquarters, but the teenagers barely left the inner keep, their bodies demanding the recovery that the constant motion of the ship had denied them. On the morning of the 4th day, the true journey home began. The courtyard of Sea Dragon Hold was filled with the sounds of snorting horses and the clanking of mail. A detachment of 50 Wolf Guard had been prepared for the overland journey, their gray cloaks heavy and warm. Arthur Dane sat atop a massive white destrier, checking the straps of his saddle. Anna mounted a spirited roan mare, her eyes bright with the prospect of the ride. Cregan, John, and Rhaenys mounted their own horses, their strength fully returned, the fatigue of the sea entirely washed away by the restorative sleep. Ben-Jen and Daisy stood by the main gates to see them off, young Brandon waving his wooden sword at the departing guards. "Ride swift, and keep your eyes open," Ben-Jen advised Arthur. "The wolfswood is quiet, but the autumn storms can be unpredictable." "We will keep a steady pace, Ben-Jen," Arthur assured him. Ned Stark had not come on this journey. The Warden of the North had remained in Winterfell to manage the vast, expanding duties of the kingdom, trusting his brother and his most elite guards to execute the retrieval of the steel. The ride through the wolfswood took a full week. The forest was ablaze with the dying colors of autumn, the leaves of the oaks and the sentinels turning brilliant shades of gold, crimson, and brown before the heavy snows arrived to strip them bare. The air was crisp, clean, and biting, a stark contrast to the suffocating, toxic heat of the Valyrian Peninsula. For the teenagers, the ride was a joyous return to their element. During the midday halts, they did not rest. Under the sprawling canopy of the ancient trees, they engaged in fierce, rapid sparring sessions. Cregan wielded twin swords, and homage to the flowing style of his uncle Arthur Dane. His dual strikes were heavy and powerful, a relentless storm of alternating blows that shook the frost from the branches when he missed and struck a trunk. He fought with an overwhelming, continuous pressure, learning to weave his considerable weight into a seamless offensive wall. Rhaenys and Anna sparred fiercely, the princess having taken up a slender, blunted ash spear, a weapon gifted by her uncle Oberyn. She moved with a dizzying, fluid agility. Anna, wielding a single sword, was a relentless instructor, pushing Rhaenys to utilize the weapon's long reach, to strike and evade before the counter fell. They danced through the underbrush, the clack of wood echoing sharply, a blur of auburn and dark hair. John wielded a standard long sword, but he rarely engaged in the loud, boisterous brawls of his brother. On the afternoon of the 7th day, the dense tree-line of the wolfswood finally began to thin. The rolling, frost-covered hills of the Winterfell lands stretched out before them, and rising magnificently against the pale gray sky were the towering, unbroken granite walls of their home. The massive iron portcullis of the Hunter's Gate was already raised as the column approached, the sentries on the battlements having spotted the gray banners hours ago. The moment the horses trotted into the vast, bustling main courtyard, the order and discipline of the arrival broke down completely. Cregan was boasting loudly to one of the guards about his adventures, as he swung his leg over his saddle to dismount. He never finished his sentence. A small, dark blur dropped from the low roof of the stables directly onto his back. Cregan let out a startled grunt, collapsing forward into the cold mud under the sudden, unexpected weight. Before he could draw a breath or throw his attacker off, a wooden spoon was pressed firmly against his throat. "Dead!" A high, triumphant voice shouted. "The great explorer is slain by the ghost of Winterfell." Arya Stark, now an incredibly fast and fiercely energetic 12-year-old, sat perched victoriously on her older brother's back, her dark hair flying wildly. She wore practical wool trousers and a tunic stained with stable dirt. Cregan, having survived fireworms and the boiling seas of Valyria, let out a defeated groan into the mud. "I yield to the fearsome warrior," he mumbled, spitting out a mouthful of dirt. Arya giggled maniacally, squirming off his back so he could stand up. Before Arya could demand a second trial by combat, a more refined, but equally enthusiastic greeting occurred. Sansa Stark, at 13 years old, was the very picture of her mother's grace. She wore a beautiful warm gown of deep blue wool, her black hair perfectly braided. She did not run, but she walked swiftly toward Rhaenys, offering a bright, genuine smile. "Princess," Sansa greeted, throwing her arms around the older girl. "We missed you terribly. The castle has been too quiet." "I am glad to be back, Sansa," Rhaenys smiled, returning the hug warmly. "I have tales that will make your hair stand on end, though I doubt half of them are fit for a lady's ears." "I wish to hear every one of them," Sansa insisted, her violet eyes shining with curiosity. Jon dismounted quietly, handing his reins to a waiting stable boy. He turned to find a sturdy, boisterous 11-year-old boy barreling toward him. Rickard Stark hit Jon with a solid thud, wrapping his arms around Jon's waist. "Jon, did you fight pirates?" Rickard demanded, looking up with wide, hero-worshipping eyes. "Uncle Ben-Jen sent a raven saying there were pirates." "We avoided the pirates, Rickard," Jon said, a soft, rare smile touching his lips as he patted his younger brother's shoulder. "We were on a secret mission. Pirates are too noisy." Standing on the steps of the Great Keep, watching the chaotic, joyful reunion of the pack, were the mothers of Winterfell. Lady Ashera stood tall, along with 9-year-old Alaric, the youngest of the Stark brood. Alaric was a quiet, observant child who preferred watching from a safe distance before joining the fray. Beside Ashera stood Princess Elia, her dark eyes scanning the courtyard until they found Rhaenys. Elia descended the steps gracefully, reaching her daughter and framing Rhaenys' face with her hands, inspecting her for any sign of harm. "You are too thin," Elia murmured, though relief flooded her voice. "The sea has taken your flesh." "The sea took my patience for hardtack, mother," Rhaenys laughed, kissing Elia's cheek. "I am perfectly healthy." Ashera walked forward, letting go of Alaric's hand to embrace a muddy Cregan tightly, then turned and pulled Jon into a warm, fiercely protective hug that made no distinction between her trueborn son and her husband's supposed bastard. "You are both freezing," Ashera declared, stepping back and looking at the 3 teenagers. "And you are covered in a week's worth of road dust. The baths have been drawn in your quarters. Go, wash the dirt from your skin, change into clean clothes, and present yourselves in the private solar for supper. Your father expects a full recounting of your journey." At the mention of their father, the 3 youths looked up toward the high balcony overlooking the courtyard. Eddard Stark stood there, his heavy gray cloak draped over his broad shoulders, his hands resting on the stone balustrade. He did not shout a greeting, nor did he rush down the stairs. He simply watched his children return safely to the den, a look of profound, quiet pride settling in his iron-gray eyes. He offered them a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. The message was clear. They had completed the trial. "Go on, then," Anna urged them, stepping up beside Ashera, resting a hand affectionately on Jon's shoulder. "The hot springs are waiting, and if you take too long, the great Jon will eat your portion of the roast." The teenagers did not need to be told twice. The promise of boiling hot water and a soft bed sent them hurrying toward their respective chambers in the Great Keep. Hours later, the private family solar was an oasis of warmth and comfort. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting a rich, golden light across the room. The long oak table was laden with the heavy, rich bounty of the northern harvest. Roasted venison glazed with honey, thick stews of root vegetables, fresh bread, and pitchers of hot, spiced cider. The younger children had been fed and sent to their rooms, leaving the solar to the older members of the pack. Ned sat at the head of the table, Ashera to his right, and Elia to his left. Arthur and Anna occupied the seats nearest the fire. Cregan, Jon, and Rhaenys sat across from them, their hair damp from the baths, wearing clean, comfortable tunics of soft wool. The sheer relief of sitting in a warm, unmoving room was evident in their relaxed postures. "Eat," Ned commanded gently, gesturing to the feast. "You look as though you survived on salt and wind for 2 moons. They attacked the food with the ravenous hunger of growing wolves, the silence broken only by the clinking of silverware against wooden trenchers. When the worst of their hunger was finally sated, Ned pushed his plate away and folded his hands on the table. He looked down the length of the board, his gaze settling on the 3 youths. "You survived the crossing of the Sunset Sea, the oppressive heat of Volantis, and the toxic fogs of the Smoking Sea." Ned began, his voice calm but commanding absolute attention. "You have seen the ruins of the Freehold. Tell me of the journey." Cregan swallowed a mouthful of cider, his eyes lighting up with the eagerness to share the impossible tale. "It was horrific, Father," Cregan started, leaning forward. "The air before we reached the coast burned the throat. The water hissed against the hull. We saw shadows moving beneath the surface. Massive things. WYRMS, Uncle Benjen called them. They radiated heat like a furnace." "And how did you avoid them?" Ned asked, testing their awareness. "We didn't row faster," Jon answered quietly, his gray eyes meeting his father's. "We stopped projecting fear. We pulled our presence inward. The ship became a dead log on the water. The beasts sought the chaotic heat of panic. When they found none, they lost interest." Ned offered a slow, approving nod. "A crucial lesson. The fiercest monsters are drawn to the loudest minds." "But the ruins, Uncle Ned," Rhaenys interjected, her voice filled with a lingering, profound shock. "The ashes piled as high as a castle wall in places. The stone is melted like wax. It is a monument to absolute destruction. We walked through the dead city for 2 days, using the breathing cloths to survive the dust. And then we found the valley," Cregan said, his voice dropping to a hushed, reverent whisper. "We crossed a ridge, and the ash simply stopped. There was an invisible wall. Inside, the air was clean. The trees were alive. It was an oasis of absolute perfection in the middle of a nightmare. There was a temple," Jon added, his analytical mind recounting the details perfectly, "constructed entirely of flawless black marble, veined with pure gold. 14 statues of dragons guarded the inner hall. And at the back, hidden behind a sealed door that required specific leverage to open, was the vault." Rhaenys shuddered slightly, though not from cold. The wealth inside was staggering. Mountains of ancient gold coins. It took the Wolfguard 3 days of constant marching back and forth through the ash to carry the crates to the ship. "And the pillars?" Ned asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The black stones. The glass candles," Jon confirmed. 6 of them. They were cold to the touch, but they hummed. A latent energy. "We packed them in thick wool and loaded them into the deepest hold." Ned listened intently as they detailed the exhausting labor of the retrieval, the eerie silence of the unburnt oasis, and the heavy, lingering sense of ancient sorrow that permeated the temple. They spoke with the hushed awe of initiates who had witnessed a profound, terrible truth. When their recounting finally finished, the solar fell quiet, save for the crackling of the hearth fire. Ned looked at his son, his nephew, and his ward. They were no longer children who solely believed the tales spun by maesters. They had seen the impossible reality of the world with their own eyes. Ned leaned forward, his face hardening into a mask of absolute, unforgiving granite. The warmth of the father vanished, replaced entirely by the cold authority of the Warden of the North. "You have witnessed a miracle of preservation," Ned said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded total obedience. "And you have seen the source of the weapons that will one day save this realm from the true dark." He locked eyes with each of them in turn, ensuring the weight of his words settled deep into their bones. "But you must understand the terrible danger of that knowledge," Ned warned solemnly. "The world believes Valyria is a tomb of fire and poison. That belief keeps the greedy, the ambitious, and the foolish away from those shores. If the merchants of Pentos, or the lords of the Reach, or the king himself ever learned that a pristine sanctuary exists within that hell, a vault filled with thousands of pounds of Valyrian steel and mountains of ancient gold, they would not fear the doom. They would sail armadas into the smoking sea. Ned's gaze was unyielding. They would die by the thousands in the boiling waters, but enough would survive to reach the oasis. Their greed would lead them to tear down the black marble, to dig into the earth, and in their ignorance, they would shatter the delicate, ancient magic that preserves that valley. The sanctuary would fall, the magma would consume it. He paused, letting the catastrophic consequences hang heavily in the warm air of the solar. What you saw in the ash is a burden, not a tale for a feast, Ned concluded, his voice an iron vow. You will never speak of the unburnt trees. You will never speak of the Black Temple. You will never mention them to anyone other than pack members. Cregan swallowed hard, the boyish excitement entirely erased from his face, replaced by the solemn understanding of a future lord. He nodded firmly. I swear it, father. The secret is buried. It remains with the pack, Jon agreed quietly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Silent as the grave, Uncle Ned. Rhaenys promised, her posture rigid with newfound duty. Ned held their gazes for a long moment, feeling the absolute truth of their vows through the subtle currents of the Force. They understood. The foundation of their future was secure. The tension in his broad shoulders finally relaxed. The cold lord faded, and the father returned. Good, Ned said softly, offering them a small, proud smile. He picked up his cup of hot cider. You have done the North a service that history will never record, but one that will save it all the same. Welcome home. Chapter 90 The Truth of the Tower. The great hall of Winterfell was loud with the morning meal. Outside, the northern summer had covered the castle in a thin layer of snow. Eddard Stark sat at the center of the high table, eating quietly. To his right sat Cregan broad-shouldered and wearing a tunic of gray wool. Beside him sat Rhaenys, her dark curls braided back tightly. Jon sat quietly near them, his dark gray eyes observing the hall. Cregan rolled his shoulders, wincing slightly as he reached for another slice of dark bread. I swear Uncle Arthur is trying to detach my arms from my torso, he grumbled, rubbing his collarbone. Those heavy wasters are going to snap my joints. Only if you keep dragging your back foot. Rhaenys teased smoothly, not looking up from her bowl of oats. Your footwork was sloppy yesterday, Cregan. You move like a wounded bear when you're tired. I was pacing myself, Cregan defended, though a good-natured grin tugged at his lips. You overcommit on the high parry, Jon noted quietly, taking a sip of water. You gave him the angle. If he had wanted to, he could have swept your legs before you even finished the swing. Cregan sighed, bumping his shoulder affectionately against Jon's. Thank you, Master of Tactics. Next time, I'll just stand perfectly still like you do and hope he gets bored. The easy camaraderie of the pack was a comfortable, familiar rhythm, but it was about to be broken. Jon paused, his cup halfway to his mouth. The subtle, ever-present currents of the Force that he constantly monitored suddenly spiked. The air around the high table grew inexplicably heavy, thick with a sudden, suffocating gravity. He glanced down the table. Ned Stark had stopped eating. The Lord of Winterfell wasn't looking at his plate. He was looking across the hall at Lady Ashera. Ashera met his gaze, her violet eyes holding a profound, heavy understanding, and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Jon's gaze shifted to the corner of the room. Ser Arthur Dayne stood there, his posture rigidly tense, his hands resting near his sword belt. He, too, was locked in a solemn, silent exchange of looks with Ned. The shift in the adult's demeanor was massive. It wasn't the frantic tension of an impending attack. It was the chilling, absolute certainty of a momentous decision finally coming to pass. Jon felt his stomach tighten, a cold dread pooling in his gut before a single word was even spoken. Ned set his knife down. Cregan, Rhaenys, Jon, he said. The three youths stopped eating and looked up. When you have finished breaking your fast, come to my private solar, Ned instructed. We have matters to discuss before your morning drills. Yes, father, Cregan replied. We will be there, Uncle Ned. Rhaenys nodded. Jon gave a short bow of his head. Ned stood up. He looked down the table at Ashera, who gave him a single, brief nod. Ned turned and walked out of the great hall. An hour later, the three teenagers walked through the corridors of the great keep toward the Lord's solar. Did we break something in the yard yesterday? Cregan whispered to Jon. If our forms were poor, Uncle Arthur would just make us run the perimeter, Jon reasoned quietly. This is something else. They reached the heavy oak door of the solar. 2 guards stood on either side. Cregan pushed the iron latch and swung the door inward. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth. Ned stood behind his weirwood desk. Ashera stood by the window. Princess Elia Martell sat in a chair near the fire. Sir Arthur Dane stood in the corner, his arms crossed. Near the bookshelf stood Anna, the auburn-haired woman who had helped raise them, looking pale and nervous. Cregan, Rhaenys, and Jon stopped in the center of the room. "Cregan," Ned said, "tell the guards outside to descend the stairs. They are to stand watch at the bottom exit. No one is to set foot on these floor until we open this door." "At once, father," Cregan said. He stepped out, spoke to the guards, and waited until their footsteps faded down the stairwell. He stepped back inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut, the iron latch clicking into place. Ned looked at Ashera, who nodded again. He let out a slow breath. "The words spoken in this room today will never leave this room," Ned began. "They will not be whispered in the yard or written in a journal." He stepped around the desk and stopped directly in front of Jon. "Jon," Ned said quietly. He placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. "You are not my son." Jon stood still, but his breath hitched. His calm awareness fractured into a sudden storm. The shift in the force was sharp enough that everyone in the room could feel his panic. Ned tightened his grip on the boy's shoulders, pushing a stabilizing wave of calm energy into Jon's mind to keep him grounded. Behind him, Cregan took a step forward, confused. "Father, what are you saying?" "Of course he is. We are brothers." Rhaenys stood frozen, looking from Ned to Ashera. "You are of my blood, Jon," Ned said quickly, maintaining his hold on the boy. "You are a Stark, but you are not my child. I claimed you as my own and had Robert legitimize you to protect you from a people who would have killed you in your crib." Jon swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. "If you are not my father, who is?" Ned did not answer at once. He let the silence stretch, the fire crackling the only sound. Then he spoke, each word measured, drawing the story out like a blade being slowly unsheathed. "It began before you were born, at the tourney of Harrenhal. A mystery knight appeared in the lists, the Knight of the Laughing Tree. King Aerys demanded the knight be found. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen found her." Ned paused, letting the pronoun hang in the air. "It was my sister, Lyanna." Cregan's eyes widened. Rhaenys' breath caught. "Instead of turning her over to the Mad King, Rhaegar kept her secret," Ned continued. "They formed a bond. Lyanna felt trapped by her betrothal to Robert Baratheon. Rhaegar was trapped by a prophecy he believed would save the world. He thought his bloodline needed 3 heads to fight the coming dark." Ned gestured toward Elia Martell. "Princess Elia, would you speak the truth of it?" Elia nodded slowly. She looked at Jon, her voice soft but steady. "He did not hate me, Jon, but my body was frail. The maesters warned that another child would kill me. Rhaegar required another for his prophecy. When he met the Wolf Maid, he believed he had found what he needed. He left me in the capital, and they fled together." "They said she was kidnapped," Cregan interrupted, voice tight. "The singers say he stole her." Ned held up a hand, silencing him. "That is the lie that broke the realm. She left willingly. They traveled to the Isle of Faces and were wed in secret beneath a weirwood tree. But their silence started a fire." He let the words settle before going on. "My brother Brandon believed she had been taken by force. He rode to King's Landing demanding justice. The Mad King had him imprisoned. My father, Lord Rickard, went to request his release. King Aerys, he gave them a trial by combat." Ned's voice dropped. His champion was fire. He had my father burned alive while Brandon strangled himself trying to reach a sword that was just out of reach. Both died screaming. Rhaenys gasped, hands covering her mouth. "The rebellion began," Ned said. "Robert, Jon Arryn, and I raised our banners. The war tore the 7 kingdoms apart. Battles at Summerhall, the bells, the trident. Rhaegar fell to Robert on the trident. The Targaryen dynasty ended in blood and fire." Jon's face had gone pale. "Then, my mother?" Ned held his gaze. "When the war ended, I rode south, not to King's Landing, but to the Red Mountains of Dorne. Rhaegar had left her there, at a place called the Tower of Joy, guarded by his best knights." Ned turned toward the corner. "Sir Arthur." The Sword of the Morning stepped forward. His violet eyes met Jon's. "I was there. Rhaegar commanded us, me, Oswell Went, and Gerald Hightower, to guard the tower and the child that was coming. We fought your Uncle Ned to protect you. My sworn brothers died in the sand. I would have died as well, had Lord Stark not spared my life. Ned took over again, voice low. I went up into the tower. I found your mother in a bed. She was about to give birth to you. She was terrified. Robert's hatred for Rhaegar was absolute. Jon stumbled backward, hitting the bookshelf. You said my mother was a woman you met on the campaign. You said she died. Ned did not flinch. I lied to the world, Jon. I claimed you as my own. I brought a box of rocks back to Winterfell and told everyone they were Lyanna's bones. I had Robert legitimize you as Jon Stark to keep you alive. The room was deathly quiet. Jon's breathing was ragged. Cregan looked as if he had been struck. Rhaenys' eyes were wide with dawning horror. Ned turned toward the auburn-haired woman standing near the bookshelves. Anna, Ned said. It is time. Anna stepped forward, trembling. She looked at Jon, her gray eyes filling with tears. Jon! Lyanna Stark wept. Jon stared at the woman who had bandaged his scraped knees and watched him practice in the yard for years. The pieces fell into place. Anna, Jon whispered. My name is Lyanna, she sobbed, taking a step toward him. I am Lyanna Stark, and you are my son. The Solar was silent. Cregan stood frozen by the door, realizing he was looking at his supposedly dead aunt. Rhaenys wiped tears from her cheeks. Jon's control broke. He let out a ragged sob and lunged forward, wrapping his arms around her waist. Lyanna dropped to her knees, catching him and pulling him against her chest. She buried her face in his dark hair, rocking him back and forth, weeping openly. I'm here, Lyanna said, kissing the top of his head. I'm here. Mother! Jon gasped into her shoulder. Ned turned away, rubbing a hand over his eyes. Ashera stepped up beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. They let the moment breathe. Slowly, Jon pulled back. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve, though his hands still gripped Lyanna's arms. He looked at Ned. Why tell me this now? If Robert finds out. Robert will never find out, Ned stated firmly. Because you will not let him. Ned stepped forward, looking down at the three of them. I tell you this today because you are no longer children. You know how to mask your intent. Ned looked at Cregan. You are the heir to Winterfell, Cregan. If I fall, the burden of protecting them falls to you. Will you shield your cousin and your aunt from the Iron Throne? Cregan recovered from his shock. He stepped forward and pulled Jon into a tight hug. He is my pack, father, Cregan said, squeezing Jon's shoulders. Dragon or wolf, it does not matter. You are my brother, now and always. Ned nodded, then turned his gaze to Rhaenys. Princess, Ned said, you have the right to know your blood. But if the South learns of Jon's existence, they will try to use him or kill him. Rhaenys stepped forward. She knelt beside Lyanna and Jon, wrapping her arms around Jon's shoulders and pulling him into a comforting embrace. Rhaenys told him. She looked up at Ned. I have no desire to sit on a throne of swords. I have a brother. My spear guards his back, today and always. Elia Martell stepped forward. She placed a gentle hand on Jon's cheek. Jon tensed slightly, but her dark eyes held no malice, only an ancient, quiet understanding. Your father chased a prophecy and broke the world, Elia told him, her voice steady. Do not carry his ghost, Jon. You are a wolf, and you belong to this pack. Ned let out a long breath. The relief was clear. The family had held together. Hear me? Ned commanded, his gray eyes sweeping the room. When you walk out of that door, nothing changes. Lyanna is Anna. Jon is my son. Rhaenys is my ward. You will carry this secret, and you will let it make you strong. Jon stood up, helping Lyanna to her feet. His face hardened, returning to its usual calm composure. My name is Jon Stark, the boy said quietly. I am your son. You are, Ned agreed softly. The king signed the decree himself. You are my son in all the ways that matter, Jon. Ned turned toward the heavy oak door. Wash your faces, Ned instructed. The morning is passing, and Ser Arthur expects you in the yard. As Cregan, Rhaenys, and Jon prepared to leave the Solar, Ned looked out the frosted glass of his window. The truth was out and the pack was intact.